Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're tackling one of the most infamous cases in American history, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping.
Oh, this one is a doozy. It's got all the elements. A famous figure, a heartbreaking crime, and lingering questions that just refuse to go away.
It's 1932, and we're talking about Charles Lindbergh, the man who made history with his solo transatlantic flight. He was an American hero.
Absolutely. Lindbergh was a symbol of hope, of achievement.
So you can imagine the shockwaves when, on March 1st, his baby son was kidnapped from their home.
From their seemingly secure estate in New Jersey, no less.
It was a crime that gripped the nation. Everyone was following the story, desperate for any news.
And what makes this case even more fascinating is the backdrop.
You mean the Great Depression?
Yeah, the country was already in a state of anxiety and uncertainty. And then this happens. It felt like the world was tilting on its axis.
So let's rewind to that night, March 1st, 1932. Paint a picture for us.
Well, it's around 9 p.m. when baby Charles Jr. is put to bed.
Everything seems normal, right? A quiet evening at the Lindbergh estate.
But then, sometime between 10 and 10:30, the nursemaid, Betty Gao, makes a horrifying discovery.
She goes to check on the baby and
The nursery is empty.
gone, just like that. And in place of baby Charles,
A ransom note. A chilling demand for $50,000.
$50,000 in 1932, that's an enormous sum.
It was a bold, calculated move. Whoever planned this, they knew what they were doing.
It wasn't just a random kidnapping, it felt like an attack on America itself, on this symbol of hope that Lindbergh represented.
And the media, oh boy, the media went into overdrive.
Newspapers, radio broadcasts, everyone was hungry for every detail. This was before the internet, so traditional media was the lifeline to the story.
And you have to remember, this is a nation already on edge from the Depression. People needed something to hold on to, some glimmer of hope.
And the investigation. I read that it was massive, unprecedented for its time.
Oh, absolutely. You had police, the FBI, even private investigators all swarming the scene, hundreds of leads pouring in, everyone desperate for a break in the case.
A nation holding its breath, praying for baby Charles's safe return.
And sadly, that's where the story takes a dark turn. After 2 agonizing months, the worst possible news arrives.
On May 12th, 1932.
Baby Charles Jr.'s body is found, just a few miles from the Lindbergh home.
And here's the truly heartbreaking detail. The ransom had already been paid.
Adding another layer of cruelty to this already senseless crime, it was devastating.
This wasn't just a kidnapping gone wrong. Someone had taken this innocent life even after the ransom was paid.
The public outrage was intense. Everyone wanted answers. They wanted justice.
And I know that the ransom money itself becomes a crucial part of the investigation.
It does. Those bills, they were marked, identifiable. So the investigators had a trail to follow.
Like breadcrumbs leading them to the kidnapping.
Exactly. Except these breadcrumbs were leading them through a labyrinth of banks and transactions.
It must have been painstaking work tracing those bills.
It was a massive undertaking. But eventually, that trail leads them to a German immigrant named Bruno Richard Hauptmann living in the Bronx.
Hauptmann. That's the name that becomes synonymous with this case.
Right. But here's where things get tricky.
What do you mean?
Having the ransom money doesn't automatically make Hauptmann the kidnapper. It could have changed hands multiple times.
But wouldn't it be suspicious for anyone to be in possession of that money?
Of course. It raises serious red flags. But remember, in the legal world, suspicion isn't enough. You need proof.
So the investigators needed more than just the money to link Hauptmann to the actual crime.
Exactly. And this is where the concept of circumstantial evidence becomes really important in this case.
Circumstantial evidence, meaning there's no direct proof, but the circumstances point to a certain conclusion.
Precisely. So while the ransom money is a strong indicator, it's not the smoking gun. They needed to find more.
And they do find more, right? A ladder discovered at the scene.
Ah, the ladder. This is another piece of the puzzle. But again, it's not as straightforward as it might seem.
So the theory is that this ladder was used to reach the second-floor nursery where baby Charles was sleeping.
That's the idea. But the question becomes, can they definitively link that ladder to Bruno Hauptmann?
And this is where the forensics come into play, right? I've read that they compared the wood from the ladder to wood from Hauptmann's garage.
They did. And they found similarities.
So case closed, right?
Not quite. Wood analysis back then wasn't as precise as it is today. Finding similar wood types is suggestive, sure, but it's not a slam dunk.
So we have the money, we have the ladder, but then there's another discovery, potentially the most damning piece of evidence: fingerprints.
Fingerprints. That was the cutting-edge forensic tool of the 1930s. Think of it as their version of DNA testing.
So they found Hauptmann's fingerprints on the ransom notes.
On some of them, yes. But even with fingerprints, there's room for doubt.
Oh, so?
Think about it. Could the notes have been handled by multiple people? Were they contaminated? Planted?
You're making me rethink everything I thought I knew about this case.
It's all about looking at the evidence critically, asking the tough questions.
Because the big question looming over the whole case becomes, does all this evidence add up to proof beyond a reasonable doubt?
And that question takes center stage as the investigation turns into a trial.
The focus shifts from finding baby Charles to determining the guilt or innocence of Bruno Richard Hauptmann.
And this trial, it becomes a media spectacle. The Hunterdon County Courthouse in Flemington, New Jersey is transformed into a national stage.
It's 1935, and the nation is glued to their radios listening to every word of the trial.
It was like the first true media circus. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone was following the twists and turns.
In the prosecution, I'd imagine they leaned heavily on all the evidence we've just discussed.
Oh, absolutely. They presented the ransom money, the ladder, the fingerprints. They painted Hauptmann as a cold-blooded, greedy criminal.
But we've already talked about the holes in that story. The questions about the strength of the evidence.
And the defense, they seize on those weaknesses. They argue that it's all circumstantial.
They say it doesn't definitively prove Hauptmann was the kidnapper.
And they raise another really interesting point.
What's that?
They suggest that Hauptmann might have been targeted because he was an immigrant.
That's a powerful argument, especially considering the social climate of the 1930s.
Exactly. This was a time of economic hardship, rising xenophobia, a fear of foreigners.
So the defense is essentially saying Hauptmann was a scapegoat.
They're playing on the idea that prejudice, and not just evidence, might have fueled the investigation and the public's perception of Hauptmann. So you've got this courtroom drama playing out, the prosecution painting one picture, the defense another, and the jury has to decide who to believe.
With all those eyes on them, the weight of a nation watching, waiting for a verdict.
It must have been intense.
And what was the verdict?
Guilty.
Guilty.
Guilty of first-degree murder. Hauptmann is sentenced to death.
Wow.
And that's when things get even more complicated.
What do you mean? He was found guilty.
He was. But even after the trial, doubts lingered.
So even with a conviction, people weren't convinced he did it.
Right. A lot of people just couldn't reconcile the evidence or the lack of it with this idea of Hauptmann as this mastermind kidnapper, this cold-blooded killer.
So what happened then? Did people just accept the verdict and move on?
Not quite. That's where the alternative theories start popping up.
Oh, this is where it gets juicy.
It does. Suddenly you've got whispers of other suspects, hints of a larger conspiracy.
Okay, spill the tea. What are some of these theories?
Well, one theory suggests that the kidnapping might have been orchestrated by organized crime.
The mob?
Yeah, maybe seeking revenge against Lindbergh for some reason, or seeing him as a high-profile target for a big ransom payout.
That's a pretty dramatic theory. Was there any evidence to support it?
Not really, no. It was more speculation than anything concrete.
But I guess you can't rule anything out.
Especially when you consider the context. This was the era of prohibition, organized crime was flourishing in America, so it's not completely out of the realm of possibility.
But wasn't there another theory, even more shocking?
Oh, you mean the one about an inside job?
Yeah, the idea that someone within the Lindberghs' inner circle might have been involved, that's a bombshell.
It is. And that theory really took on a life of its own, fueled by rumors and speculation.
Do you think there's any truth to it?
It's hard to say. One version of the theory even suggests that baby Charles's death might have been an accident.
An accident?
Yeah, like a tragic mishap that was then covered up to avoid a scandal.
Wow. That's a whole other level of conspiracy.
It is. But again, we're talking about theories, not hard evidence.
So were any of these alternative theories ever seriously investigated?
Some of them were explored, but none ever gained real traction. The evidence just wasn't there.
It sounds like the Lindbergh case is a magnet for conspiracy theories.
It makes sense. You have a high-profile family, a tragic death, unanswered questions. It's the perfect recipe for speculation.
So even after all this time, all these investigations and theories, are we any closer to knowing what really happened?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There have been attempts to re-examine the case, to use modern forensic techniques to try and get some answers.
Like DNA testing.
Exactly. In the 1990s, there was a big push to reopen the case and use DNA evidence, maybe to exonerate Hauptmann or point to someone else.
What happened?
The results were inconclusive.
Oh, man. So even with DNA, we still don't know for sure.
It's frustrating, isn't it? You want to believe that science can solve these mysteries, give us those definitive answers. But sometimes, even with the best technology, the truth remains elusive.
I guess that's part of what keeps people fascinated by this case, even almost 100 years later. The mystery endures.
Absolutely. And even though we may never definitively solve the mystery of who kidnapped and killed baby Charles, there are still things we can learn from this case.
What do you mean?
Well, this tragedy had a ripple effect, an impact that went far beyond the Lindbergh family. It forced the nation to confront some uncomfortable truths about itself, about the vulnerability of even the most powerful and famous.
So what are some of the ways this case changed America?
Well, one of the most immediate impacts was the creation of the Lindbergh Law in 1932.
I've heard of that, but remind me what it is.
This law made kidnapping a federal crime, increasing the penalties, especially if the victim was taken across state lines. It was a direct response to the Lindbergh case.
Makes sense. They wanted to make sure something like this never happened again.
Exactly. They were trying to deter future kidnappings and give law enforcement more power to pursue these crimes.
I bet it also had a huge impact on the public's perception of safety, especially for parents.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine living through that time. This symbol of American achievement, this seemingly invincible hero, is brought down by this unimaginable act of cruelty.
It must have shattered people's sense of security.
It did. And the media's relentless coverage of the case, the constant headlines and theories and speculation, it all added to this feeling of national unease.
Like danger could be lurking around any corner.
Exactly. And for the Lindbergh family, having this tragedy play out on a national stage, it must have been incredibly difficult.
Their grief, their every move, scrutinized by the media.
It raises questions about the role of the media in these kinds of cases, doesn't it? How do you balance the public's right to know with the individual's right to privacy?
Especially during a time of such intense personal tragedy. It's a debate we still have today.
It is, and the Lindbergh case is a powerful reminder of the media's ability to both inform and intrude.
So we've talked about the evidence, the theories, the trial, the impact on society. But I think there's another piece of this puzzle that's really important to explore.
You mean Charles Lindbergh himself?
Yeah. He wasn't just a victim in this story. He was a complex historical figure in his own right. And understanding his life, his beliefs, it adds another layer to our understanding of the whole case.
I agree. Lindbergh was a man full of contradictions. His story is fascinating, but it's also really complicated.
So let's talk about those contradictions. What are some things about Charles Lindbergh that might surprise people?
Well, he was this incredible aviator, a symbol of progress and modernity. But he also held some views that were, let's just say, out of step with the times.
You're talking about his politics.
Yeah. In the years leading up to World War II, Lindbergh became a vocal advocate for American isolationism. He didn't want the U.S. to get involved in the conflict brewing in Europe.
And that was a controversial stance, right?
Oh, absolutely. Especially as the Nazi threat grew, many people saw his views as naive, even dangerous. Some accused him of being sympathetic to the Nazi regime.
Did he ever clarify those views?
He did express admiration for Germany's technological advancements, but he also condemned their persecution of Jews. It's a complex issue, and his stance wasn't always clear-cut.
It's a reminder that historical figures are rarely simple.
Right. We can't just categorize them as heroes or villains. They were real people with complex beliefs and motivations.
And we have to remember the context of the time. The world was a very different place back then.
Exactly. Our understanding of things like race and politics has evolved so much since the 1930s.
So looking back at the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, knowing all that we know now, what are some key takeaways you think are important to highlight?
Well, I think the case really underscores the power of mystery. Even after all these years, all the investigations and theories, we still don't have all the answers.
Like a puzzle with some pieces missing.
And that's what keeps people fascinated by it. It's a reminder that sometimes the truth remains elusive.
It also shows us how much the media can chase public perception.
The Lindbergh case was a turning point in how media covered high-profile crimes. It was the first real media frenzy.
And that's something we still grapple with today. The influence of the media, especially with social media and the 24/7 news cycle, it's even more powerful now.
Absolutely. And then there's the story of Lindbergh himself. He was this American icon but he also held beliefs that many found troubling. It's a good lesson in not idolizing historical figures.
Seeing them as human beings with all their flaws and contradictions.
Exactly. History isn't just about dates and names. It's about real people making choices, living their lives in complex circumstances.
And sometimes those lives intersect in ways that create these enduring mysteries, these stories that continue to fascinate us generations later.
And that's the beauty of history. It's an ongoing conversation, and we all get to participate.
So for anyone who wants to delve deeper into the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, what resources would you recommend?
There are some great books out there. The Lindbergh Kidnapping by George Waller is a good place to start. It's a comprehensive overview of the case.
And for a different perspective, one that challenges the official narrative, you could check out Ludovic Kennedy's The Airman and the Carpenter.
That one's sure to get you thinking. And of course, there's Lindbergh's own autobiography, The Spirit of St. Louis. It's interesting to read his account of his life, his thoughts on the kidnapping.
But it's important to remember that it's his perspective, his version of events.
Right. As with any historical source, you have to be critical, consider the author's bias, the evidence presented, draw your own conclusions.
That's great advice. So as we wrap up our deep dive today, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think it goes back to what we were saying about the power of mystery. This case, it reminds us that even with our best efforts, sometimes we may never have all the answers.
And maybe that's okay.
Maybe. Sometimes the questions are just as important as the answers.
They keep us curious. They challenge us to think critically.
They remind us that history is an ongoing conversation, and that's what makes it so fascinating.
Well said. And to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning. The Lindbergh baby kidnapping is a case that will continue to intrigue and challenge us for generations to come. And who knows, maybe someday some new piece of evidence will emerge, shedding light on this enduring mystery. Until then, keep those minds open and those history books handy. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.